Hey everyone, Joe here from OnTheStick.com, and it's time for another episode of Same Name, Different Game. You know, ever since I started doing this series, people have asked me about a particular pair of games. It seems like this pair of games is the pair of games that this show was made for. Two different games with the same name. One for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, one for the Sega Genesis. Both are done by completely different developers, published by completely different publishers. One is considered a classic in its library, although both are considered excellent in their own right. If you haven't figured it out yet, on this episode, we're talking about Disney's Aladdin.
In November of 1992, Disney's Aladdin hit movie theaters, and it was a huge hit, as every animated movie Disney made at that time was. The movie retold the story of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp from 1001 Arabian Nights. This was during Disney's second renaissance, falling in between Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King. Aladdin ended up grossing over $500 million when all was said and done, and quite naturally, much merchandise followed, including some video games.
Both versions of Aladdin were released in November of 1993 to coincide with the October VHS release and, no doubt, the holiday season. Now, the Genesis version was handled by Virgin Games and the Super Nintendo version by Capcom. In most cases, you would expect these games to be essentially mirror images of each other, with the Genesis version having slightly degraded graphics and sound. However, due to the way the rights were structured, that's not how it turned out. You see, Capcom had the Disney rights for Nintendo platforms, but not Sega platforms. So, Virgin had them for Sega platforms, and the games turned out completely differently. The other thing you might expect is for one, if not both of these games, to suck ass. I mean, it's a natural reaction, really. They're licensed games from the 16-bit era. However, both of these games are good, but in different ways.
So let's start with the basic differences. The gameplay is decidedly different in these games. Capcom's Super Nintendo title is basically a Mario-esque platformer. Your only weapons are apples, which serve to merely stun all but the smallest enemies. Larger enemies, including bosses, must be dispatched by, you guessed it, jumping on their heads. The Genesis version, meanwhile, has some intense platforming sequences, especially during the escape from the Cave of Wonders, but focuses more on combat for the most part. In Virgin's game, Aladdin carries a scimitar, as well as the apples found in the SNES game, but the apples in this game are deadly, and, in fact, must be used to defeat Jafar in the final battle. The combat in the Genesis title is pretty deep as well, allowing you to clash swords with the Sultan's guards, effectively defending yourself, but not overburdening the player with a difficult control scheme. The head bouncing of the SNES game isn't bad, but Aladdin has this weird front handspring animation he does after hitting an enemy, and it can make it tough to gauge consecutive bounces and time the second button press to get extra air. When it comes to graphics and sound, it would typically be assumed that the Super Nintendo version gets the edge. In this case, I would refute that. The music? Yeah, it's probably better on the SNES, but Tommy Tallarico did the Genesis music, and it sounds pretty good for a non-Sega developed game on the Genesis. Faint praise, I know, but it's not just a symphony of farts, so that's saying something. Well, judge for yourself. Take a listen. Now, the graphics in the Genesis version are spectacular. They're good in both, But using a proprietary animation engine called Digicel, developed by Dave Perry and his crew, the Genesis, in spite of its ability to display from a meager palette of 512 colors, as compared to the Super Nintendo's over 32,000, shows us a game that looks decidedly better than its counterpart in motion. Perry would of course go on to form Shiny Entertainment and create Earthworm Jim. But take a look at these graphics.
Now, Capcom's game doesn't look bad. Far from it. It's colorful and vibrant as Capcom's games of that era tend to be. And it's definitely got the edge in audio. But let's take a look at something that matters a little bit more. The level designs. Now, both games follow the movie pretty closely, but the level progression is a little different, and the level design is totally different to suit the different gameplay styles.
The stages in the Super Nintendo game tend to be more straightforward. Walk from left to right, reach the end. The Genesis stages, on the other hand, have a slight exploratory tilt. It's not a Metroidvania by any stretch, but the levels involve going back and forth, and Aladdin can look up to keep his eyes out for bonus items and which way to go next. The SNES game features a mechanic involving red gems, and you can unlock an alternate credit sequence by collecting most of the red ones. Other than that, they can be used as currency. You can buy wishes, which are continues. On the Genesis, you can also collect gems, and there they're used for buying extra lives or continues. Grabbing the red gems in the Super Nintendo game takes some skill and mostly involves another exclusive gameplay mechanic, the sheet. You can glide using a sheet, which helps with some of the platforming elements, but it can also make them too easy. In the course of the levels, Aladdin can find items to get him to bonus stages. In the Capcom game, catching the Scarab will grant you an end-level bonus stage. It's basically Wheel of Fortune with the genie. In the Virgin game, there are 2 bonus games, each reached by grabbing different icons. Getting the genie's head will take you to a game similar to the SNES game, except that landing on Jafar will take all your credits away. Getting an Abu head will take you to a stage that allows Abu to collect bonus items while avoiding obstacles.
Now, the level designs in the Super NES game aren't necessarily bad. They're just not as interesting as the Genesis version. But they're executed very well, which goes a long way. There is something I need to bitch about, though, in terms of level design. It happens in both versions, but it happens more in the Genesis version. They put shit in the foreground. It happens all the goddamn time. During this era, there was a need to show off the graphical prowess of a system with little bells and whistles, like multi-layer parallax. Unfortunately, they would waste a parallax layer on the fucking foreground, and it just gets in the way. It doesn't show things off to create a more rich world, it just is annoying and impedes your progress.
The dungeon stage is the worst. Look at all this graphical clutter. Compare it to the SNES version. Sure, the maze-like elements of the Genesis stage are more interesting, and the vertical scrolling gives you a real sense of climbing out of the dungeon, but this almost invalidates the good design by making it damn near impossible to see.
But enough about parallax. I will say that the biggest pain in the ass in both games is the escape from the Cave of Wonders on the Magic Carpet, though it is worse in the SNES version. It's like a shoot-'em-up with no shooting, and Aladdin's hitbox is the size of his entire sprite, so you can't touch anything or you fall off the carpet, and you have to start over. The Genesis version at least has the decency to make it a bonus stage after you get past a certain point. So once you get past that point, after you fail, you still move on to the next level. The SNES version, of course, has no such consolation.
Look at this. It's brutal, and I failed it time and time again. As a matter of fact, the first time I played this game on a rental when I was a kid, I never got past this part. I fucking hate this stage.
Before we get to the final stage, there is one other thing I want to mention since we're talking about failure. Both versions contain limited continues, my least favorite thing about games from the 8 and 16-bit era. What's even more ridiculous is that they both have ways to work around it, which raises the question, why even bother having them in the first place?
The Super Nintendo version is more egregious, as it has a password system. So, rather than just let me continue again, you're gonna make me enter a fucking password? At least it's a short one.
At least the Genesis version has the sense to hide it behind a code. Well, two codes, actually. The first is a level skip cheat, which is A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A. The second is a cheat menu, but you'll want to use the level skip code because the cheat menu only allows you to select your starting stage. After you beat whatever stage that is, you automatically go on to stage 2.
Okay, let's talk a little about Jafars Palace. The final stage in both games, it leads to the final confrontation with Jafar. In the SNES version, it's a pretty straightforward platforming romp, as the levels tend to be in that version. In the Genesis version, it's a sprawling, multi-directional level with, well, too much shit in the foreground, but otherwise, some pretty nice platforming sections coupled with plenty of combat. And look at these wrecking balls. Given the Genesis had no scaling technology, that's a pretty impressive effect. The final battle with Jafar is decidedly different as well. The SNES version tends to lose out on bosses, as there are only a couple of them in the entire game, but Jafar is pretty impressive. In his giant snake form, as we see at the end of the movie, he takes up half the screen. You stand on his body and have to time it right to bounce off his head. The Genesis didn't quite have this kind of power. Even with Virgin's Digicel technology, they couldn't have done this. So while the other boss fights are great, especially compared to the non-existent SNES ones, this one falls a little flat. You throw apples at Jafar until he turns into a snake, and then you throw more apples at him. And that's it.
Alright, it's that time. Time to give the edge. Now, before I do that, I want to say that both of these games would make an excellent addition to any retro gamer's library, and both sold several million copies, so it's easy to find one on the cheap. Ultimately, though, I gotta go with the Genesis version. It just has more to it. I mean, come on, EGM's 1993 Genesis Game of the Year. The Super Nintendo version, I mean, there's a million games like that out for the Super Nintendo. The Genesis game is a much more unique beast, and it's one of the best looking games on the system, right up there with Gunstar Heroes. Alright, well that's it for this month. I hope you come back next time and join us again, and make sure to check out onthestick.com for all of our episodes, as well as our bi-weekly video game podcasts, and I'll see you next time.